This week on the Salesforce Admins podcast, we are talking to Lisa Tulchin about learning and how you can be a better learner, and also, as a Salesforce admin, how you can help teach and educate and drive user adoption with your users. I've known Lisa for over a decade now. She's a senior curriculum developer at Trailhead. She's done both in-person and self-paced learning. She's created both, so I feel like she's a real expert on this. And we cover a lot because I had a lot of great conversations at Trailblazer DX about learning. And I know admins are always learning, so that's why I wanted to cover that. Now, before we get into the episode, I want to be sure that you're following the Salesforce Admins podcast on iTunes or Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. That way, when a new episode drops, like this one, and it's amazing on learning, on Thursday mornings, it's immediately on your phone. So be sure you're following that, and then a new episode will drop. So with that, let's get to, this is such a fun episode. Let's get to Lisa Tulchin. So Lisa, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. It's such a privilege to be here.
Well, we've known each other for a while, but I am unleashing you to the Salesforce ecosystem because I feel like I've secretly held this decade of awesomeness of knowing you. And talking about learning. That's what we're going to talk about today, in case you didn't listen in the intro. But Lisa, let's level set because I've had the privilege of working with you and seeing you teach and create and do, and that's why I wanted to have you on the podcast. But let's start with what you do at Salesforce and kind of how you got here.
I am a senior curriculum developer, which means I help write content for the product education team. I have been focusing almost exclusively on instructor-led training. So when you sign up through Trailhead Academy or one of the boot camps before an event, to be in a live or virtual classroom with the person. So that's what I have been focusing on. But the group has expanded over the past year, and I will no longer be focusing just on that type of content.
Yeah. And so if you think about it, you know, what's great about Salesforce is we have lots of different methods of learning and to kind of hover around. I've seen you do instructor-led training, and we have that. We also have Trailhead or what'd you call it? Self-paced learning?
Yeah, well, so Trailhead is one example of self-paced learning. And I have, in my past at Salesforce as a full-time employee, because I've been here 3 years, I have actually written a few trails. Mm-hmm. I may start writing them again. We're still figuring out exactly the roles, but that's just one example of what we'd like to say self-paced. And self-paced really means that you as an individual go to the resource and, I guess, take it in, read it, test it on your own timing. You know, the difference with if you're in a classroom, you're following the agenda with the instructor and you have to do things in a certain order and a certain pace. But self-paced, and Trailhead is one example, Slack and Tableau or other resources that have their own training repositories that you can also take in at your own timing. So that's why we use the term self-paced.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. Otherwise, I was just going to call it instructor-led and not instructor-led.
Exactly.
Like hot dog, not hot dog, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so I feel like here is the question everybody thinks I'm going to ask, and I'm not. Because everybody would ask, okay, Lisa, well then which is better, instructor-led or self-paced? And I'm not going to ask you that question because I think it's the wrong question to ask. I think what the right question to ask is how, as a Salesforce administrator getting into the ecosystem, do I figure out if in-person or self-paced learning is best for me?
Ooh, I like that question.
Yeah, that's why I'm asking it.
Yeah, no, I really like that question a lot. I think and it's the hardest thing with radio, of course, is that people can't see me thinking. Like literally, when I think, like I always think my face shows the wheels turning, but I have to remind myself that y'all can't see that. So I am
They're
thinking
envisioning
through,
it.
and you visualize Lisa looking
Yes.
away, and the gerbil or the hamster in her brain
Right.
is
It's
running on
smoking.
that wheel. Yeah, exactly. I think you have to stop and have an honest talk with yourself. Like, what have you found for yourself in the past? We're all adults going into this scenario for the most part. And I'd like to think that by the time we get to that stage, we understand a little bit about ourselves and how we take information in. So, for example, if you're just starting out in the ecosystem, even not even for example, I'd say the first thing you should do if you haven't already is actually go to trailhead.com and sign up for an account. It's free to do that. And you automatically then have an enormous number of resources at your fingertip just through that site. There is Trailhead, the slightly gamified self-paced learning that's available to you for Trailhead resources. There's also Trailhead Academy, which are the classes, but there also is the community, and so your peers. So I think that's one way that you can explore and test out waters. Like if you're thinking to yourself, I think I could do this on my own. Well, if you log in and you see how you feel after taking a couple of what they call modules or trails or badges, then that may be a sign that you're good to go. But if you're doing this and you're thinking, I need a little structure, right? Then you immediately do have resources because you can sign up for ILT, but you also have the community so you can go there, maybe find a local user group through that site and ask questions of other people there.
Hmm.
So I think like that's the first thing is have an honest talk with yourself. See if you can figure out for yourself what your learning style is. You know, I personally often need that instructor. I need that person in the room, either live or virtually, helping talk me through things. Honestly, helping me keep focused on what I'm actually doing. There are other resources there. I sometimes need like a map. I like to have a map. I also need to be goal oriented. So for me, credentials were a natural way to think about things. And even if you're not going to study and earn a credential, there is a section on the site for credentials, and they have, like, for example, if you are just starting out in the ecosystem, the Salesforce Associate certification might be a really good starting point. And they have recommended badges and trails to take. So that's what I mean is like it's just some guidance. Even if you don't think that cert is for you, you could look at the map to get that cert and kind of follow that along and take information in.
No, I think you're so spot on. I often see a lot of people in the community ask a question assuming someone else has the answer. And I really think a lot of people forget they have the answer inside them. They know what way they learn best. They just sometimes are looking for validation in that. Listening to your answer, I was thinking back to, yeah, when I had to tackle something big, I really needed that in class, sitting next to somebody with an instructor so that I was focused. And it's not that I can't focus at home or at work. It's that I think you probably know this. People sometimes try to do a Trailhead module and answer email and maybe watch a webinar,
What?
and it's like, stop, you can't get away with that in class, you know?
You can't.
So that's what I find. That's what I find.
Yeah. And I mean, the other benefit is finding a local Salesforce user group can also be
Hmm.
super helpful because I think typically they have regular meetings at a certain date and time. And so
Hmm.
I find, there's a lot of talk about what they call the beginner's mindset and how we all have to have the beginner's mindset. And I think it's really
Hmm.
hard and it's easy for us to talk about, but truly being beginners it's scary. You don't know something. You don't know what you don't know. For me, there's that fear of messing up. And that's definitely something I've learned, like teaching adults. And I have also taught kids, or yeah, kids. They were actually kids. And kids are a lot more comfortable making mistakes than we are as adults.
Why do you think that is?
I think part of that is that feeling of as adults, we're supposed to know everything. If we
Mm,
followed a traditional path, we've gone to college, we've maybe gone on to graduate school, and we're just supposed to know. You're supposed to be able to move and function in an environment. And saying, I don't know, is one of the scariest things I think for adults to admit.
mhm.
And that's one reason why I just encourage a community and peers, because there typically are themes for meetings where people go and either someone's presenting or sharing what they know, or everyone's there asking questions. And sometimes it's just being in a room and having somebody else ask a question that you've been worrying about. It almost makes you relax a little, feel somewhat more secure, and that's one reason why I would recommend that.
Yeah,
Now, I say that as an ambivert, as someone who is very uncomfortable in situations where I don't know people. So it's actually quite challenging for me. It's easy for me to say, "Go join the local user group." Actually showing
right.
up to that first meeting of a user group is really hard for me. But once I settle in an environment and I can feel more comfortable, I am very outgoing, but that's what that ambivert talks to. But that first getting me out the door. So if you're sitting here and you're listening to me talk and saying, "Lisa, you are crazy. There's no way I'm ever going to join a user group. That's talking to people I don't know." I get it. And that's why, in a way, there's a virtual user group. People can chat. I think every cloud, for the most part, has its own section of the community where people can ask questions and help each other. And as I said, we have all these self-paced environments where you can little by little take on information and take it in without having, if you're truly introverted, you don't need to interact with anybody else.
So I'll flip the coin a little bit from us learning to admins teaching and maybe even user group leaders doing some of this birds of a feather or instructor walking people through stuff. What in your experience in both you said you've taught children, you've taught adults, what in your experience really resonates when you're trying to walk some adults through new technology or new functionality and have them learn?
There are a lot of different words for this,
Oh,
but yeah, I was like thinking about how I was going to answer you while you were asking the question. I came up with 3 or 4 different ways of saying the same thing. When we first worked together, it was with them. What's in it for me?
mm-hmm,
I think now they talk a lot about personas or jobs to be done. So I'm
mm-hmm.
throwing these out there in case folks listening have heard any of these. The really important thing for adults is that when they go into training, or if you're trying to think of developing training for them, the training speaks very specifically to what they need to know to get the job done. When you're teaching kids, you can teach them almost any topic, and they'll be much more trusting about, I don't see the why, but I understand you're telling me, and therefore I need to know. But with adults, it is so critical that they understand the why am I sitting here, or why am I watching this video, or why am I reading this job aid? If you can't, I think, figure out the why, and everything should hopefully flow a lot easier from that why. For one thing, you'll have immediate buy in from the people that you're working with, Because if they don't understand the why, they tune you out, right? And if you have that why, you have their attention. They're I'm not saying they're going to be eager, willing, and able to, like, when they're sitting in the room, but they're going to be more likely to be behind you or stay with you as you go through it. And it also will help them remember what you're training them. It can be overwhelming to sit down and learn a new technology. Now, Salesforce, as we both know, has evolved and is constantly, I think, improving what they call the user experience, the
Mm-hmm.
way that you as an end user take in the system, but it's still scary and new and challenging. So the more that you get what you need to know in the moment that you're needing to know it and not getting a lot of extra stuff, that's another thing that's really important in designing training. Another thing people may have heard or some folks throw around is the 80-20 approach, which is that training should focus on the 80% of what people need to know. So dividing the focus of the training to be almost exclusively on what they need to know 80% of the time. And maybe if you have time, have an extra session or just provide an additional resource for what they need to know 20% of the time. Part of that is I've learned a lot about the science behind the way we take information in, the way we remember things. And that's another reason to kind of emphasize what they need to know now, as opposed to the nice to have for that couple
Mm-hmm.
times a year. I mean, think about it, right? If you're a salesperson and you're learning how to use Salesforce, you really, what do you need to know? You need to know how to enter leads if you're doing Sales Cloud, right? You need to probably know how to do leads so that you can track potential sales. And then you need to know how to create probably an opportunity so you can track an actual sale and maybe how to add products to that opportunity. But that's the bulk of your time, right? Creating leads, creating opportunities, tracking activity around those two records. But you may not close, depending on the type of business you do, you may not close that many opportunities in a year. Like it may be a lot of nurturing. Focusing training on closing opportunities may not be as important. That's just one example.
No, that's a really good example. So here's why I was looking forward to this podcast. So can I take those two principles and turn them on their head and ask you, do those two apply? And I'll regurgitate those when admins are trying to learn Salesforce through Trailhead. And those two principles I'm pointing at are that they may or may not understand why, and they're trying to focus on the 20% versus the 80%.
Mm. So that's a really good question because having, there's from the admin perspective, there's just so much to learn.
Right.
And it can be overwhelming. I think honestly, what I had to do, and I'm trying to like remember when I was first starting out, I had to I broke things down. Like instead of looking at the whole 100%, what I did was I looked at. Now I admit, because I've never sat in the job, right? I've never
Mm-hmm.
sat in the chair as an admin. I was looking at the admin certification and I was looking at the breakdown of the exam and looking at what the breakdown of the exam was like and what was had the most emphasis in the exam. And then I was thinking, well, that's probably what's the hardest or I mean, I probably was going about it the wrong way from that point of ignorance, but I felt like that's most of what admins have to do. And so like for me that I would probably break it down and focus section by section.
I think that's good philosophy. I mean, I was kind of sneaking that question at you because I feel like it's one thing to give people advice on how to instruct, but then it's also on, does that also apply to us learning as well? So
Yeah.
you tackled it well. How does some of this work as we both, I mean, we focus on learning and being new, and that applies throughout the years. But is there anything you think of if you're going into perhaps training an older set of users? And so, there's median age, like obviously companies, try to hire for diversity, but some companies have older users. And should you think about, how to frame things differently, or if you're in that set, is there a way to think through, maybe because you teased, and I'd love to know more about the science of what you read on learning.
Oh, yeah. So there are a couple of things popping into my mind with that. One is that there has been a lot written, and I've only read a little bit about how generationally differences in learning. So that Gen X, Y, and Z, millennials, I'm not sure exactly the lineup, they learn differently. And the younger employees are, having grown up in a much more digital first age, take information in differently. So I was just, if you're training older employees, there are a couple of things that come to mind. One is my feeling, oh my goodness, I may be approaching older employee, quote unquote, as a group. um, but the other thing is that try to be sensitive to what you may encounter as resistance may actually be fear.
Mm.
There can be a sense with new technology in particular, a fear of, I know how to do things really, really well in the previous system, method, whatever you want to call it. This is something new, and I don't know how to do my job well. And the reality is there is age discrimination, and so you could be starting to spiral into a fear cycle. What if I can't catch on? What if I can't do my job? What if I can't, quote unquote, wrap my hands around this new technology? Am I going to lose my job? So I think there's a level of that could be behind what you might be perceiving as resistance with older employees that you wouldn't necessarily be receiving from younger employees. For one thing, they're closer to being in that true beginner's mindset where they really don't know things and are taking things in all the time. They're less likely to be as insecure about their job and potentially a little more open to systems changing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing that kind of pops into my head. And I have gone and I've trained people on how to use a CRM system when the previous one was paper. And there was a range of employees in the room. They did tend to be older, and there was a lot of resistance to that. So it could also depend on the shift that you're making. Like if you're going from one online system to another online system, it likely would have less resistance. I kept emphasizing, you're just carrying around an iPad. You're not carrying around, stacks and stacks and files and files. Look
Yeah.
how much easier this is. And a lot of them, though, still were like, but everything's in my head,
Mm-hmm.
and now you're making me write it down. So I think the reality is change is hard no matter what. I think it's just as someone who might be in charge of training others, being open to the fact that what you may be seeing as intractable resistance could actually be a fear-based response.
One thing you said, which is the biggest thing in all of learning, which is change is hard, right? Anytime you're learning
Yeah.
something, because something is changing. And I believe you were part of this project with me I've always tried to really make it resonate with admins. Hey, when you're rolling out a new app, make sure you're paying attention to all the other changes that are going on in the organization. Because I know the project that we worked on together, we had a big change in the organization on top of a technical change, right? And you can be focused on, well, we're just rolling out Salesforce, right? Oh, but there's organizational structure and there's a whole bunch of other changes going on. I think it's one thing, it can be a little hard maybe for an admin to wrap their head around organizational change, although they should. But looking at yourself individually, is there something to be said for kind of taking an inventory in the amount of change that's going on in your life while you're trying to learn something? Does that affect how you gain your knowledge?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's a really good point, which is that, and actually something popped into my head. Sorry, when you were talking about how when we worked together, there was a big change,
Mm-hmm.
not just a technology, is that you may encounter resistance to training people on a new technology because the new technology could be the convenient scapegoat for a lot of the anxiety and fear around change that is happening.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes it's good to just open things up or just acknowledge and be open to the fact. I was in a meeting with someone recently who I loved the way they opened it. They just opened it with a phrase that they said they'd been taught, which is, let's start off by hugging the elephant, was what they said.
Oh, I've never heard that.
Isn't it wonderful? I loved that.
Uh-huh.
They had a picture of like a baby elephant and
Oh,
people hugging
cute.
it.
Yep.
But it was really, let's start out by hugging the elephant, which is to just acknowledge up front that elephant in the room. Like, we're not going to tiptoe around a topic. So it could be as simple as opening up a training with, hey, I know there's a lot going on. Let's just acknowledge that right out and maybe give 5 minutes for people to just talk about it and get it off their chest. And then they'll feel better. They'll kind of have cleansed the air a little bit. And you can move into, okay, let's focus on how the system works. But I've noticed myself personally, yeah, if a lot of things are happening and I'm under stress, I could have more trouble focusing, which means that as an learner being in a classroom, it's harder for me to take things in if things aren't paced appropriately, which is a great way for me to seg into the science of
Mm.
learning.
Nice segue.
Yeah, like the way I took that and I
Very
brought it back
subtle.
to where I wanted to go five
Yep.
minutes ago, whatever it
Yep.
was. That was so subtle. Um, so, from a science perspective, there's this feeling of, and as a curriculum developer, we talk about the need to what we call chunk things out. So, it's break things down. And now, admittedly, my research is a little outdated on this, but when I was first learning it, they talked about no more than 5 or 7 things in any given segment. And that sometimes, especially with software training, it's really hard because in order to do a task, you may actually have to do a certain number of steps. It may be, but I really try to break training down by tasks. So if I have an exercise, I'll have broken the exercise down into tasks. And if I've written a task out and it's more than a certain number of steps within that task, that's usually a sign to me that this might be too big a chunk. And I go back and I see, do I have to break this down further? And every exercise, I should say, is pinned to a scenario. And so it all goes back to the scenario. So, okay, and this exercise, it's usually a scenario. Like either you are an admin or you're like observing an admin who has something to do and they're trying to do ABC. And I'm like, oh, well, maybe A, B, and C is too much, too big a chunk right now. And it has to really be A, B, or maybe even just A. And that's kind of the way I approach it because You need to only give so much information to a person, and then you need to shift gears, and maybe you need to talk about something else for a while, let them process. It's another reason why a lot of training with systems is around watch me do it, now you do it.
Right.
We don't always have the time. I wish we would I always wish we were given more time for training, but you may not always have the time. So it may be introduce a concept and then have people walk through, but just make sure you're not having them walk through too much at one given time.
Yeah, training, unfortunately, is always like the landscaping when you're building a new house. It's the last thing, and you have no money left. And it just ends up being, here's a flower from the hardware store. Congratulations.
I know. I really wish we'd had, be able to have the full landscape architect at all
The
times
whole
and
thing,
a full,
the drawing,
tear
everything.
the yard out, rebuild it entirely. That's what I feel. I
Yeah.
mean, that's one reason why it's nice that there is a resource such as Trailhead. And I haven't even talked about it, but when you onboard as a Salesforce customer, there are other resources that are available to you or to companies and to customers, especially if they're on a success plan. There are
Mm-hmm.
whole libraries and resources available to them. So I would say, as an admin, find out, is your company, um, do they have a success plan? And if so, which plan and what resources are available to you? And if you have them, take advantage of them. Like some of them are one-on-one coaching, I think, for Premier. So
Yeah.
like you have all these resources, and I would say take advantage of all of the resources that are available to you to help you learn and then help you get everyone else working towards using the system effectively.
One thing I thought of as we kind of bring this around to a close, one thing you do that is exactly what admins do. I mean, you do a lot, but is approach a brand new feature and have to learn it.
Yeah.
Because you have to write training for it. I mean, you have to write Trailhead modules and all kinds of stuff. And admins maybe don't necessarily have to train somebody else on that, but they have to learn it themselves. I would love to know, based on your experience, how do you, when a new feature comes down into your queue and you're like, I got to write a module on this and I got to learn this feature, what's your approach?
I personally might be more of a maximalist than a minimalist.
Oh,
Yeah.
please explain.
Um, I want to get my hands on all the things and digest them to try to figure out what is the essence there. Now, I admit, I am learning this not because I'm going to have to use it every day in my job. I'm learning this because I want to understand the full picture in order to be able to distill it down to its basic essence. So my objective might be a little bit different. I would say that the task is easier if it's something that is new to me because there will be resources that are out there for me to take in. When it's net new, the challenge really can be trying to figure out how something works when there aren't as many resources. But I would definitely say being part of the ecosystem, like stay plugged in, keep an ear out for the announcements that happen at the regular events, such as the TDX, the conference that just happened.
Mm-hmm.
Big announcements will be made at Dreamforce and at TDX. There are also what we call world tours, which are events that take place in different cities around the world. I know that it's not possible for everyone to attend these, but there is the Salesforce Plus website, and a lot of the keynotes and major presentations from all of these events are available for free streaming. And actually, I think Salesforce Plus has other admin focused resources that could be amazing right
Mm-hmm.
there. And especially if you're a visual or an auditory learner, and by that I mean watching something or hearing something, that could be a really good resource because you can listen to the announcements, and then they have sessions that focus on different aspects of different clouds. And so you can listen in and hear announcements and sharing about resources. The Salesforce blog is another good site because there'll be articles published there talking about new resources. And that's kind of how I get my information for like net new content. And then the release webinars. And, I know as an employee, I have access to all of them, but keep an ear out for resources such like that because they'll share all the changes that are coming and there'll be demos of how it works.
Yeah, no, there's a ton out there. You very much are a maximalist.
I know, man. I know.
Could just imagine going to all the things and watching a release.
I'm not saying do it all. I'm saying pick and choose, right?
Thank you, Lisa, for being on the podcast. I appreciate you coming by and sharing resources and helping us understand the world of learning. Again, what's funny is if you've listened to this podcast for a while, you know how many times we keep mentioning know the why. And I've done podcasts with Kevin Richardson on the 5 whys. I've worked with the Trailhead team on understanding the why. It really always keeps coming back to the why. But I will tell you this, listening to this episode, I learned something, which was the whole point. But it really kind of sunk into me. The fear could equal resistance when you're doing training. I've run into that where people are super resistant. And it was out of fear, not out of the willingness to learn. So I think that's interesting. I really hope you got something out of this. I love the way Lisa approached training and talking about 5 to 7 steps. I feel like that was super important. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, can you do me a favor? Share it on social. Share it to one person, maybe send it to a text to a friend that could be doing training. I promise you have to know somebody that's doing training. That or at a user group, you could share it, be like, hey, I listened to this great podcast about training, and I learned about 5 to 7 steps in the 80-20 rule, but you got to listen for the 80-20 rule. And of course, if you're looking for more great resources, just check out the show notes. Also, everything is at admin.salesforce.com, including in the show notes, a transcript of this episode. And of course, we will post this to the Admin Trailblazer community, which is one of the plethora of places that you can go and ask questions and help other Salesforce admins learn. So, of course, until next time, I'll see you in the cloud.